Physiological variation in humans is also extremely common, right? Um, Now, for example, a person of the same gender might have different, physical activity, physical characteristic, right? So it is important to measure the height and weight and consider the age of a person while uh, medicating the patients, right? And that's why you actually weigh them and then you calculate how much dosage they require based on their height and weight and age, of course. And the medications will also differ based on whether they have any physical condition. Just say somebody goes in with a bacterial infection, but they have a liver condition or a kidney condition. So you cannot give them a medication that will damage the kidney and the liver further, right? So that's why you always consider physiological variation in the clinical setup. A typical example of physiological variation is that a man who's 22 years old and 154 lb who does light to moderate physical activity may consume about 2800 kilocalories a day, but a woman of the same um, height and weight and who's about 22 years old will take about 2000 calories a day, which is usually enough, right? Another example is that a normal woman may take about 2000 calories a day, but a woman who has given birth and was lactating is constantly hungry uh, because she is nursing the child. If she's nursing the child, she gets really hungry and she might consume about 2500 to 3000 kilocalories a day. So physiological variation differs from person to person, and it also depends largely on the age, the physical activity, the gender, and the race of the person as well. Okay, a lot of time. Okay, so characteristics of life. We're just going to look this over really quick. Um, Humans and other living organisms uh, share many similar characteristics. So all their body cells are interdependent and they are multicellular organisms. Of course, bacteria is not multicellular, but all animals and all humans are multicellular. And body functions contribute to their overall health. Okay, so they all share some general characteristic. The first one is that they are highly organized. They are highly organized because they have different organ systems. You have the digestive system near the abdominal region, then a thoracic region that is near the lungs. You have the heart and the respiratory system, and in the head you have the brain, the skull, etc. So animals and humans are highly organized. And the second feature is cellular composition. These are living matters, so they are highly compartmentalized into one or more cells. Because without compartmentalization, you won't be able to distinguish between the physiological characteristic, right? The stomach performs a lot of digestion, but the function of the brain is entirely different from the one of the stomach. So the cellular composition is different and they're highly compartmentalized. And all living organisms um, metabolize substances, meaning they synthesize molecules and they digest molecules. Then we eat a potato. We break down the potato into small glucose molecules. And when we have too much glucose, it is converted into glycogen and stored in the liver. And when we need energy, the glycogen is converted back to glucose and broken down to form energy, right? And then all living organisms are responsive. Now, this one is unusual. Responsiveness is the ability to sense and react to an external environmental stimulus. Okay, now this is also sometimes called as excitability. L-I-T-I. Okay, excitability is a term we'll come across when we look at the nervous system and the muscular system. Okay, let's say you touch a hot stove and you pull your hand away, right? This is an example where our nerve cells are excitable and they tell you that the stove is hot. And the muscle cells, which are also excitable, help you pull your hand away. Okay, so they communicate with rapid electric signals, and that's why they are called excitable. Okay, and then a lot of different organisms move, right? So movement of the body can be achieved because of the muscular and skeletal system. And inside the body, we have the digestive system, urinary system, and the cardiovascular system that also move with involuntary muscles. And that's why the heart can contract, right? So now we come across another term, which is contractility. So when cells move, like muscle cells, they move by shortening. So this is called contractility. So keep this in mind. We'll come across this again in the later chapters. Okay. Some other characteristics of life include homeostasis. Now, let's not talk about homeostasis just yet. Just understand that homeostasis is the maintenance of a stable internal environment. Okay, we'll talk about this in a lot more detail. And then uh, the next characteristic is development. Now, all organisms grow and develop. Okay, they increase in size or increase in number of cells and body parts. So they divide and eventually they grow bigger and they develop. Okay, development, for example, is the development of an embryo from conception to a full baby, right? That's an example of development. But when the baby grows larger in size, the cells divide. That is called growth. So the increase in size of the organism is called growth, but development is differentiation of cells and growth of the organism altogether. And then all living organisms reproduce, meaning they have the ability to produce an offspring. Cells divide to produce two identical daughter cells, right? So for example, when you scuff your cheek cells, you have fresh cheek cells and they all look alike, right? So that is called reproduction of cell. And not only that, as adults, we may choose to have kids, right? That is also a process of reproduction. And then all living organisms evolve, meaning they undergo some minute changes in genes depending on the environment, right? Mutation is an example of evolution as well. Okay, so any change in gene is considered evolution or a mutation if there's a mutated gene. Okay, we'll talk about that later when we talk about cells, but these are some general characteristics of life. Now, the only other characteristic that I want to focus on a little more is metabolism. Metabolism is the sum of all chemical processes in the body. There are two types of metabolism: catabolism, meaning breakdown of chemical substances. So when you eat a potato, the starch is broken down by enzymes, right? That is called catabolism. Catabolism is catastrophic, meaning it breaks down. Okay, so catabolism. And anabolism is adding up. Okay, so you break down those smaller molecules into really tiny micromolecules. And these molecules later combine to form larger fat cells. That is called anabolism. Anabolism is a building up of complex chemical substances from smaller, simple components. One of the key features of survival is homeostasis. Homeostasis. Okay. Homeostasis is something that you will always come across when you're studying physiology. So make sure you understand the concept really well. Homeostasis meaning a stable internal environment. So the state of equilibrium when the body is happy and all the body functions are normal. That's normal for the body, right? That is called homeostasis. Now, everyday functions like digestion, absorption, and normal functioning of the body requires a constant internal environment. So it needs a state of balance. You need the right amount of calcium, the right amount of potassium, the right amount of glucose and water. If you don't have enough glucose, you feel tired and you feel lethargic. If you don't have enough water, you get dehydrated, right? So the state of balance is called homeostasis. Okay, so the body will not function if it is uh, not in the right condition. For example, your normal body temperature is about 97.7 to 99.5 Fahrenheit. That's your normal body temperature. If your temperature falls below, say 97.7 degree Fahrenheit, you can uh, die of hypothermia, right? And that's why people die in the frozen ocean, like in what's that movie, Titanic, right? Jack died because the water was really cold. He died of hypothermia. And if your body temperature shoots above 99.5, you have a fever, right? So the normal body temperature, let's write that down as some of you aren't aware, anywhere between 97.7 to 99.5. On an average, it's about 98.6 Fahrenheit. And anything above or below this range can cause a lot of damage to the body. If you get too cold, the body stops performing biochemical reaction and the body stops making energy. And if your body temperature gets too high, you end up having a fever. A fever above, say, 102 or 103 degree Fahrenheit can cause your body cells to be destroyed. And eventually, your brain cells get destroyed. You'll see how later. But everything in the end comes back to the intracranial pressure and the nutrients in the brain, right? So that's why homeostasis is extremely important. Now, homeostatic mechanisms are processes known as feedback loops. You have two types of feedback loops. One is positive feedback loop, and then you have a negative feedback loop. And all of this loops, their goal is to maintain a perfect temperature and fluid composition of the body. Okay, so the fluid that are present outside the cells are known as extracellular fluid. Don't worry about this just yet, we'll come back to it. Okay, so just remember, homeostasis is a state of uh, constant internal environment. There are two mechanisms. The first one is a positive feedback loop, and then you have negative feedback loop. So for homeostasis to occur, the body communicates using two major systems. The first one is the nervous system, which communicates with electrical impulses along the nerves. And then we have endocrine system. The endocrine system communicates with the help of hormones through blood. And all mechanisms for homeostasis involve at least three major components. The first component is called a receptor. Now, the receptor is the sensor monitor. So the structure that senses the change in the internal environment and responds to the change is called a receptor. Okay. Now in scientific term, that change is called a stimulus. Now the receptor sends a message to the integrating center, also known as the control center. Now the control center is the region that makes a decision and directs a response. Okay, so there's a set point in the control center. Okay, and if that set point gets altered, the control center sends out a response telling the body to make sure homeostasis is maintained. Okay, let's take an example. The normal blood pressure of the body is 120/80, and the receptors for blood pressure is present above the heart. So these are stretch receptors that monitor the blood pressure. So the stretch receptors are the receptors for blood pressure. From the stretch receptors, nerves carry the information to the control center, that is the brain in this case. So the cardiovascular centers, the control centers are located in the medulla oblongata of the brain that respond to changes in blood pressure as well as different things like oxygen and carbon dioxide. Okay, so the control center makes a decision and directs a response to the heart, telling the heart to maybe pump faster so the blood pressure can be increased. Okay, so the next component is the effector. Effectors are components that allow the control center to respond to the stimuli finally. So the effectors are the structures or cell that carry out the final action. Okay, for example, when the blood pressure is low, the receptor senses the stimulus and sends a message to the control center. In this case, this is the brain. And the brain sends out a message to the effector, which is the heart. And the heart pumps faster to increase the blood pressure. Okay, so these are the main components of homeostasis. So the first mechanism we're going to look at is negative feedback mechanism. It's called a negative feedback because this type of mechanism tends to dampen or just buffer the changes. So a lot of time it negates the effect. Okay, and by negating the effect or dampening the effect, it helps in maintaining homeostasis. Let's take a very simple example of the thermostat in your houses to understand this mechanism. Let's just say the thermostat in your house is set at 68 Fahrenheit. So this is the set point. When it's really cold outside, the room temperature falls to 67 Fahrenheit. This change or stimuli is detected by the sensor in the thermostat, and this thermostat receives the message and commands the furnace to kick in. The furnace blows out heat and the room temperature rises to 68 Fahrenheit. And when the temperature is returned to normal, the thermostat shuts off and the temperature is returned to normal. When the room cools down again, the process repeats. You see how it is a loop? It keeps going on and on and on to make sure the temperature is maintained at 68 Fahrenheit. So from this example, the room temperature is the stimulus, because when the temperature falls, the sensor detects the change, right? So this the temperature is the stimulus, then the sensor or thermometer in the thermostat becomes the receptor. The thermostat asks the furnace to kick in. So the thermostat becomes the command center or the control center. And finally, the furnace is the one that blows out hot air to maintain the temperature. So the furnace becomes the effector. Okay, so you can see that the temperature, or if it gets dampened, right? If the temperature gets reduced, the furnace kicks in. If the temperature increases, the AC will kick in, right? So if the temperature increases, the effector will become the air conditioner. Okay, so this is called a negative feedback mechanism because the effect gets dampened. Okay. Okay, so this is another example of negative feedback loop. When you wake up in the morning, you're a little cold. If you're too cold or even a little cold, the blood vessels in the skin constrict, meaning they decrease in diameter, they become smaller. When you constrict your blood vessels, you conserve heat. And if you're too cold, your body begins to shiver. Shivering is basically a heat gaining mechanism. Okay. And then the body is brought back to the normal temperature. Now, if your body is too warm, if you're too hot, your blood vessels dilate, meaning they open up, they increase in diameter. When your blood vessels open up, blood is allowed to flow easily through the blood vessels, and you lose water and you start sweating. When you sweat, your body begins to cool. So sweating is a heat loss mechanism. Okay, and in this manner, negative feedback loop reverses the stimulus. Okay, so if you're cold, your blood vessels constrict. If you're hot, your blood vessels dilate in order to make sure that your body is maintained at 98.6. So this is a dampening effect. No matter what the condition is, the effects get dampened to bring the normal temperature to the usual set point. And that's why this is called a negative feedback loop. All right, another classic everyday example is blood pressure. So when you wake up in the morning, so you lay down flat, it reduces the blood pressure. So when you wake up in the morning, your blood pressure is really low. And we just looked at stretch receptors, right? The stretch receptors in the heart detect the change in blood pressure. So the blood pressure is the stimulus. The baroreceptors or the stretch receptors in the heart is the receptor. The receptor sends a message to the brain, and the brain causes the heart to beat faster. So the brain becomes the control center or the command center that communicates with the heart and tells the heart to beat faster. And so the heart becomes the effector. When this happens, the blood pressure rises back to normal. It won't go beyond normal, right? And homeostasis is restored. And that's why it's called a negative feedback loop, because it's a constant loop. and the effect, no matter what, gets negated back or dampened back to the actual set point of 120/80. So this is the normal blood pressure. Okay, so in any given condition, make sure you know what the receptor is, make sure you know to identify the control center or the effector. Now, positive feedback loop is another type of mechanism. Now, positive feedback loop is not so common, whereas negative feedback loop is uh, a very common mechanism that the body undergoes all the time. Okay, so this is the negative feedback loop is more common in the body. Now, positive feedback mechanism is the type of mechanism which amplifies the condition. Okay, so in a positive feedback mechanism, the change gets enhanced or amplified, enhancing, right? So it just keeps adding up rather than being negated or dampened. That's why it is called a positive feedback mechanism. So positive feedback mechanism often makes the homeostasis or the equilibrium more unstable. Okay, so this is a self-amplifying cycle, and this is not very common. All right, so sometimes the positive feedback loop can be really dangerous. For example, when you get an infection, um, your immune system gets activated, and as a result of an active immune system, we end up having fever, right? Now, if the fever is say up to 101 or so, it's okay. But if the fever shoots above 102, 103, it can cause excessive damage to the cells of the body, including the brain. And in some cases, the damage to the brain can be irreversible. So positive feedback mechanism is an amplifying cycle. And sometimes it can be really dangerous, but not always. An excellent example for positive feedback mechanism is the contractions that occur before childbirth. Now, let's look at how the process occurs. It all starts when the head of the fetus pushes against the cervix, and the cervix has receptors. Okay, the messages are sent to the brain, and the brain stimulates the pituitary gland to secrete oxytocin. Oxytocin again stimulates more contraction, and the baby pushes the head towards the fetus even more. Okay, so when oxytocin is produced, this process gets amplified. Okay, the stimulation and the contractions get amplified, and it causes a lot of pain, right? So this is an amplifying cycle wherein things just keep adding up, and the process or the effect gets exacerbated instead of being buffered, right? So this is a good example, but in this case, make sure you know to recognize the initial stimulus. So when the head of the fetus touches the receptors on the cervix, this is the initial stimulus. The brain receives the signal and commands the pituitary gland. So the brain becomes the command center, and the pituitary gland secretes oxytocin. So the pituitary gland becomes the effector. So in this case, you can also say the oxytocin is the effector because oxytocin further stimulates more contraction, and the contractions increase and the head again pushes against the cervix. This happens until the baby gets ejected out of the body through the birth canal. Okay, so this is an amplifying cycle.